Hey friends, welcome to our channel. Welcome to Persevere Together. My name is Josh Canning. I'm with my beautiful wife Lisa Canning.
Oh, you're so
Yeah, I know
nice.
you're very pretty. We talk about mental health on this channel, specifically as it affects marriage. We come at it from a faith perspective. We're devout Catholics. We love to look at how we can build the best possible situation for us when dealing with mental illness from practical perspectives and from perspective of faith.
If you are watching this live and in real time, can you hear us? Because we did an entire episode and it was so deep and personal and like we could not believe we had to do it again. So if you are watching this, can you let us know in the chat if you can actually hear us? We're going to keep going because it
Yes.
looks like we're good.
Yeah,
but
I think I know where to look for the audio levels now. But anyways, what are we talking about today, Elise?
we're talking about the impact of our family of origin, like of your childhood experiences, which includes your family of origin, but of course it can include a myriad of other experiences and how that might impact your mental health.
Yes, and I would say this has been more recently impressed upon me. Okay, let me just go into my history a little bit. So I experienced depression as a teen. That's way back in the 90s. And then there was a period of basically 10 years, which was the early years of our marriage throughout my 20s. And it didn't resurface again until I was in my 30s. When it came back in my 30s, I was very surprised because I thought this was just developmental, growing up, rough experiences.
I remember when you told me, yeah, you had like serious depression as a teen. I was like, doesn't everybody have serious depression as a teen?
Right. And so what I wasn't aware of is how there's infrastructure that is kind of created when you're growing up that in times of prolonged stress is going to resurface. At least in my case, the stories that, or the conclusions, the beliefs that I adopted as a young person were still there later on, and you could just, I guess, say resurfaced, and there was an unconscious story I was telling myself that I wasn't aware of. So we just want to talk a little bit about that. If you're experiencing depression or anxiety or some other mental health challenge, we just want to look at the link between childhood, because knowledge is power, and knowing how that could be at play if you're experiencing a mental health challenge can help you also get healing from that. So let's just dive in a little bit. Yeah. So genetic factors are a real thing. For example, if you have a parent who has a bipolar disorder or similar issue, you're 70 or 80% more likely to experience that yourselves. And this isn't completely understood, but genetics seem to play a role, as well as just family environment and influence. You see people, how they deal with stress, and you adopt some of that without even being aware of it. One of the things that really surprised me, so I've been in counseling at different times, and a couple of the intake forms really surprised me. One of the things they have you do is not just look at your own mental health, but all of your family members. So it's like list them, and any awareness you have of them having any particular kinds of challenges with mental health or similar challenges. For example, their relationships, their marriages, all these things. You basically map out your whole family, and not to get sort of too personal, but I noticed commonalities that I wasn't even really processing before. Like there was a story that was in my family that I wasn't even super aware of. We also just experienced a lot of at a time when I was kind of in my formative years. We experienced a lot of change, moving around a lot, going to different schools, these kinds of things. And I wasn't aware how that impacted me until I looked at when I was very, very young and was describing teacher relationships. We were moving a fair bit, rural places, and I happened to be a kind of a hyper kid. And I found I was centered out quite a bit in by successive teachers. So you could say, oh, he was a bad kid or whatever. But I was in a way centered out for rejection by teachers. Now, combining that with the natural, I guess, challenges that I'm not getting into that much about home life, I think I adopted a story that I am simply different than everybody else, that I am simply worse than everybody else, that I'm simply wrong. And in a way, I thought I grew out of that when I wasn't experiencing mental illness. But then I believe that same belief surfaced later in life when I was experiencing depression. There's something fundamentally wrong with me. People can see it. I don't know what it is, but I am worthy of rejection, not acceptance. Lisa, I don't know if you want to ping pong off that. I know you've done a lot of work in like internal family systems and whatnot, but what would you say to that belief?
I want to give that little Josh Canning a hug, you know, like the one who is 6 or 7 years old and said like, there's something really wrong with me. You know, these are the messages, like when these become beliefs, you carry them with you until you do the healing work of releasing them. But even when you do the work of releasing them, they can still be like a scar and something you revert back to, right? And so these messages we receive as children it doesn't mean you're doomed if you have them, but they can have a big impact on your adulthood. I remember one therapist that I worked with, he had me reflect on power. He was like, who did you observe had the true power between your mom and dad? Like what, you know, what did that look like? And that was a really interesting lens to kind of look back on my childhood with as well.
And how, like, with the knowledge then, because I want to make this practical for our viewers, how does the knowledge of that power dynamic, you know, or that sort of message or belief, how does the knowledge of that then help us take away some of its control?
You start to ask, is that really necessary for safety? And so without going into too many, you know, details, it's if you have a strong desire to be right all the time, it might be because you observed that the more powerful parent had to be right all the time, just as an example, right? And so then if you're bringing that belief into your own marriage, you can start to say, wow, I have a tendency to need to be right all the time. Does this sound at all familiar to you, Josh? Right?
Right.
I can give you like hundreds, if not thousands of examples in our marriage where I felt like, no, this has to be my way. Right. And so when you can be like, no, you know what? It's safe to not get my way. And that can be very difficult. But then you start to kind of like literally train yourself. One of my my spiritual director gave me this homework. He was like, I want you to let your kids load the dishwasher in the way that is so not the way you would do it. And he was like, and you're doing that every single day of your gosh darn life, you know, like, so when you can start to practice these things, like it's fine to have preferences and you may actually be right. For the record, you may actually be right. But in human relationships where you can't just boss people around, being right isn't necessarily going to produce a correct outcome. You have to actually care about people. You can't just be like a bulldozer, right? And so that is an example when you can start to realize like, wow, I have like a real tendency, like, and this is beyond just having a preference. This is like, I must get this my way. You can start to make it more and more safe by literally telling yourself that you will be safe, proving to yourself that you will be safe. And then, like my spiritual director suggested, literally doing things that are the opposite of the way you would want it as a way of practicing that muscle and growing in holiness, like at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. I think it's really important to look at both, like realistically, the reality that if you have a parent that has certain challenges, you might inherit them to some degree. Or if you have a parent that, for example, in this case has mental illness, or a sibling, you perhaps more likely statistically to have that. But that doesn't mean that necessarily has to continue on throughout your family history forever. God gives us great creative power to interrupt things in our lives.
I am still very controlling.
Right.
I am innately very controlling. I think I have softened in my like age a little bit, like just innately. But I'm still extremely controlling. But the difference between like Lisa 20 years ago and Lisa now is I've had to learn how to be a more pleasant person to be around, and so I've just had to learn. I've had to learn how to adapt and how to be more flexible.
Another thing I think would be important just to mention is adverse childhood experiences. I don't know if you've read the book Hillbilly Elegy, but the newest or the vice president elect, his name is, why am I forgetting it all of a sudden? JD Vance. He talks about his childhood growing up in Appalachian, Ohio. And when you look at adverse childhood events, so things like
trauma of any kind.
Yeah, very much often from a parent or authority figure, but physical abuse, being pushed or hit or punched by a parent,
not having basic human needs like enough food, enough shelter.
Yeah, and being mocked by a parent publicly, these kinds of things. These are very highly associated with mental health challenges later on. So you didn't get the proper care that you deserved. However, again, when we're saying like it's important to sort of know these things, knowledge is power. He's vice president of the United States elect, right? Like this
clearly
person,
you can be like high functioning.
Yeah. You can transcend circumstances when you understand the circumstances. I think that's the thing I really want to, I guess, like hammer home in this conversation is we just don't want to allow unconscious beliefs to be in the driver's seat of our life.
What's the problem, Josh, with not bringing this kind of stuff to awareness? Like, why don't we just kind of like go along blindly, not examining anything from our childhood? For some people, they don't want to do that.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can, but I think you'll probably find that you're doing something. Like if you're not choosing the response to this wound, let's call it, then like if you're not consciously choosing the response, then you will unconsciously choose a response, right? Be that, finding distraction or,
being
self-medicating, or like, it could be a lot of things, like trying to blunt realities. Or you're so afraid that you actually don't do the things you could do. For example, maybe if you had a very difficult childhood, you're afraid to be a parent. You're afraid that it's determinative of what will happen in your own family history. We're here to say that's not the case. Like you don't have to be the parent that you had. And even if you're struggling in parenthood right now, you don't have to keep being the parent that you feel like you are.
And it can, and this is why I believe so much in the work of, mental health advocates, of coaches. There's so much healing that can happen. I'm going to quote, forgive me, I don't have his name handy, but it was a Protestant pastor. I was listening to this YouTube video, and he was talking about how, like, when you receive furniture where assembly is required, right? He was putting together this nightstand. He inadvertently put the whole thing on backwards, and then the lid wouldn't, the top wouldn't fit. So he was like, he couldn't force it. He tried to force the top to go the right way, but because he built the whole thing backwards, it couldn't. So he had to disassemble it. And I think he was making the point. It's such a great analogy. Sometimes if you have a very deeply ingrained groove in you because of a preference, because of something you saw as powerful or more safe, some disassembly might be required, and that's okay.
And that's another way of describing, I think, counseling, isn't it? Like talk therapy. It's like uncovering what you're not aware of, someone reflecting back to you what they're seeing and helping you ask, like, is this really true, or is this a thought or a belief?
Healing is like the best. It's sometimes is grueling. It sometimes is very difficult. It can be messy. It can sometimes not be linear, but at the end of the day, I think it's a magnificent process. Like it's I was saying this, I was on a panel yesterday for a book launch, for a book I'm featured in. And there's a great question that my lovely friend Erin presented to me. She was like, Lisa, how does God see you? And I think this disassembly, this healing is coming back to how God sees you. You've got a lens that perhaps from your childhood, is slanted a certain way, right? But there's a way that God sees you. And I don't mean just in the way that he's a loving father. That's absolutely true. But I mean uniquely I see you, Lisa, as a charismatic person, as an energetic person, as a woman of ambition, of a woman, wanting to change the world. Like
Mhm.
those very specific things that you've been given, that sometimes your childhood experience can actually make you
Mhm. Mhm.
like quell.
Mhm.
So like stifle and
Mhm.
hide
Mm.
sometimes. And
Mhm.
so that returning back to, Lord, how do you see me?
Mhm.
I think is a very powerful
Yeah,
question.
and that's another answer to what you posed to me is why is it important to be aware of this? Well, the reality is we don't want to allow the devil to have a foothold in our life either, because bringing the spiritual lens, we realize we're not just thoughts. We're not just rational beings. We're also spiritual beings, and the devil will use what he can to interrupt God's plan for
Mm,
our life.
mm,
So that's another thing I want to get into. Before I do, I just want to say, the other aspect is when we think about trying to create the context for which our children will not perhaps inherit the challenges that we might be experiencing right now, some protective factors. So this is from ChatGPT, but it says, although risks may be higher with the family history, factors like strong social support, healthy lifestyle habits, and resilience building activities can help mitigate these risks. So we can try to,
resilience building. I love that.
yeah, and how can that look in our own lives? Well, we can ourselves be striving to be healthy, be fit, have good nutrition. These are things that are correlated with, better mental health, and let our kids see us striving for things to the extent that we're able. So again, we whatever happens, we're not our parents, and we don't have to have the same story. And so, and now to bring it into a fully kind of spiritual place now, there's I guess, Catholic counselor named Dr. Bob Schutz. He has a book called Be Healed, and he does ministry around healing. When you are dealing with things and you're identifying a wound, like I was describing, right? So I'm growing up as a little boy, and in a couple different places we lived, had a teacher that was a particularly hard person, who had a particular ire for me, it seemed, and was willing to really center me out for punishment. Essentially, I felt I was worthy of rejection, right? So Dr. Bob Schutz would suggest that that wound is a wound in itself, but it also could have a spirit attached to it, right? Like we know we have guardian angels, and we know the demons want to um, upend the work of God in our lives and create footholds. So what Bob Schutz would say is, you want to identify the wound or spirit and name it. So in this case, perhaps it's a internalized rejection. So I felt rejected by my teachers or other authority figures. Now I'm rejecting myself. I'm worthy of rejection, right? So he would suggest we name that. So perhaps that I'm just going to call that spirit rejection. Um, then he suggests that we verbally renounce that spirit. So in the name of Jesus, I renounce rejection, or I renounce the spirit of rejection. And then he suggests we rebuke the spirit. So in a way, we command it to leave. So we've renounced it, and now we say, I rebuke rejection and command it to depart in the name of Jesus. And then we want to replace that spirit. So we replace with God's truth, and we might say, I receive, in place of rejection, I receive God's affirmation and peace and love. And then we essentially invite the Holy Spirit to come into our hearts and to reclaim that place where that wound was. I mentioned in a previous podcast, sometimes I struggle with like kind of waking insomnia. And what I do in those first moments is I kind of naturally go to some place of blame. You did this in the past, or you did this recently, or whatever. And I'm trying now to, when I wake up and feel that, I'm trying to follow this kind of a process, which is renouncing whatever it is, recognizing it could be like a spiritual foothold, and then inviting God into that. Perhaps it's helpful for you. The book is Be Healed by Bob Schutz. But any other thoughts, Lisa, on this topic?
I think the fear I have sometimes is that I began my healing journey, let's say, or this path of greater awareness, I would say midway through my parenting journey. So I can see it in my kids. Like I can see I was a much more controlling parent in the beginning. And I can see the impact of that on them. But I can also see the growth in intimacy with each of my older children, particularly in the sense that they've also watched me make repairs. They've also watched me admit when I am wrong. They've also watched me grow in resilience and those kinds of things. So I would say if you struggle with, like, I used to ask this of my therapist all the time, like, am I just going to pass on like every, bad habit I have, like, to my kids? And are they just going to, I was like, do therapist kids, like, do they come out perfect? Like, and he was like, absolutely not. Like, everybody, like, they're going to have their own problems, and there's going to be other things that happen. Not everything is, small T trauma, sometimes happens because of relational, things we say, but there's all kinds of things that can happen that you have no control over.
Right.
There's large T traumas. There's trauma from teachers, like Josh was saying. There's, things that you literally, like, we had a child in hospital that was extremely traumatic. You can't really control that. Right. So so if you have that fear of, like, gosh, am I just going to pass on all my bad habits, or is it just inevitable, and you kind of get doomsday about it, just be encouraged. This is all part of living on this side of heaven and growing in that sanctity. That is what our job is really here in this temporary assignment.
Yeah, and what a great opportunity to model humility, which is one of the greatest, I think, guards against anything, anything evil in our lives. We can humble ourselves again and again, recognizing that is a path to heaven. God says, like, to be like the little child, right? And we trust above all that God is at work. We put our faith in Him. He works. What do they say? Draws, use crooked objects to draw straight lines or whatever. But it's all good. We're growing. We're work in progress, and it's participating in the Lord's work in our life. So hopefully that was interesting. I don't know. Sometimes you share a bunch of stuff and you're like, I don't know. I hope this connects with people. Let us know if any of this resonated with you. Feel free, of course, to join us over at our locals community, perseveretogether.locals.com, perseveretogether.locals.com. If you feel so inclined to support our ministry with a monthly membership, that's amazing. We're working on resources to help couples manage these challenges in their marriages and to persevere. Thanks for joining us, guys. God bless.